Chapter 3 of Dr. John Dee, Elizabethan Mystic and Astrologer, by G.W. Hort. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Dee had been now some 12 years in the riverside house of Mortlake. They had not been obscure or isolated years, including, as they did, a journey abroad on some unnamed business of the Queen's, continual marks of court favor, and the frequent visits of important people. Nor had they been mentally idle ones. Apart from his public services, the scholar had been indefatigable in his researches, striving always to increase his store of good learning, experimenting with his scientific instruments, and adding to his library of other men's wisdom manuscript works of his own. He had arrived at an age when the student and thinker looks for some definite result of his study and thought, when he is, as a rule, sufficiently wearied with the path to desire sight of the goal. There are not sufficient grounds to infer, with some of his critics, that Dee was obsessed by the old alchemical ambitions of finding the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life. But the discovery of these and kindred secrets may well have appeared to him as a possible solution of his financial embarrassments, and as an opening to a way of freedom for still greater quests. A good deal of the work done at Mortlake must have had a practical purpose in view. But Dee did not feel that the alchemical experiments made by him and the young assistants he hired to work with him were carrying him fast enough towards the wished-for heights. The idea of access to certain stores of wisdom which God had withheld from man, but had, presumably, given to spiritual creatures of a higher order, had long attracted him, and had gained, with advancing years, increasing power over his mind. As he himself pathetically phrased it to Edward Kelly in the first days of that notorious fellowship, he had long been desirous to have help in his philosophical studies through the company and information of the angels of God. Here we see the influence of his astrological studies, studies which, when intelligently pursued, must needs widen the spiritual outlook. Magic, vulgarly so called, he utterly repudiated. He declared, neither studied nor exercised in it. And insofar as magic professes to accomplish or discover anything independently of the will and help of God, he spoke the truth. In the strict sense of the word, he never practiced magic. He merely practiced certain means by which, as he believed, the spiritual part of him might be aroused and put into communication with the spiritual world and those who inhabited it. Crystallomancy, the time-honored practice of inducing visions by gazing into a clear depth, may well have commended itself to him as one of the most venerable of such means, hallowed, as it were, by generations of devout seekers after hidden truths. He had always, besides, taken a keen interest in the science of optics, then making such bold strides in unexpected directions, and he already possessed some curious mirrors of which strange possibilities he must have been aware and over which he must have often mused. Had he himself any faculty of seership? A fleeting glimpse of it is suggested by the entry in the diary. But from the first it is evident that he knew his limitations, knew that this was a path to knowledge he would not be able to tread alone. It is in accord with occult tradition that the gift of vision belongs but to a few, and those few not necessarily of the highest intelligence or profoundest learning. The seer, in his purely intuitive faculty, might well be the mere instrument of lofty purposes which he did not really understand or share. Experience also tended to show that seership was a power more often displayed in the young and immature than in the old and experienced. So C sought for a scryer among his youthful disciples and assistants, and he was soon convinced that he had found what he wanted in one Barnabas Saul, who, with the pious pomp and circumstance always so dear to him, he proceeded to consecrate as his scryer. He is a shadowy figure enough, this forerunner of a greater medium, this young lay preacher turned occultist, who, later under the terror of the law, was to repudiate the powers he had claimed, and to slip back into the obscurity from which Dee had drawn him. Saul served the doctor in the capacity of seer for little more than 2 months. His scrying was done with a globular crystal, described by Dee as my stone in a frame which was given me of a friend, and placed according to a reported supernatural injunction where the rays of the sun could fall upon it. When, in later days, Dee showed this stone to Kelly, he told him of his belief that certain good angels were answerable to it, in other words, in the habit of manifesting either in or near it. I was once willed by a scryer to call for the good name of Aniel to appear in that stone to my own sight. This curious remembrance suggests Saul's power of conveying to Dee his own sense of vision, but it also suggests the part played in the invocations by Dee's own will and knowledge. It was certainly he and not Saul who identified the apparition with Aniel, the answering angel who, in the Talmudic tradition, often made God's secrets known to men. And it was quite as certainly Dee's subliminal mind that transmitted the strange, significant message of Aniel that many things should later be revealed to Dee, not through Saul, but through a seer who should succeed him and be assigned to the stone. This prophecy was not long in fulfillment. Early in the spring of 1582, Saul was brought before the judges at Westminster on some charge, which, whether one of sorcery or not, involved perilous inquiries into his occult practices. The young man thought it safer to disown his psychic gifts, and also, it seems, to slander the sage in whose service he had been using them. He and Dee parted on ill terms, but the unpleasant episode had not quenched Dee's devout desires. Only 2 days after Saul's departure, the scholar's diary records the coming of another guest, who was introduced as the friend of a certain Mr. Clarkson, and who gave the name Edward Talbot. The stranger, who was about 27 years of age, at once began to speak of occult matters, and when he declared himself willing and desirous to see or show something in spiritual practice, the scholar eagerly produced the showstone and told, as aforesaid, the tale of its powers as an instrument of vision. In a short time the young man, kneeling devoutly before it, was praying with apparent sincerity that sight might be given to him therein, while the elder, kneeling or sitting a little apart, earnestly invoked the help of God and his good creatures for the furtherance of the action. Of this seance, the first of many with the same seer, Dee records with joyful triumph that, before it had lasted 15 minutes, an angel, Uriel, the spirit of light, appeared in the stone. So began the long association of our scholar with one who was so deeply to influence his life. It is an association which irresistibly recalls Hans Andersen's story of the learned man and his ambitious shadow, which, by the dint of trading on its owner's kindliness, contrived to make itself appear the more substantial and important personality of the two. Edward Kelly, alias Talbot, there is considerable doubt as to which was his true name, was a born adventurer with, as it would seem, the ingenious brain and personal charm which many of his kind possess. Miss Charlotte Fell Smith, in her Life of Dee, rightly says that sober fact and wild romance are so inextricably mixed in Kelly's story that it is difficult to know what to believe. But, at any rate, the traditions of his career are hardly those that would have grown up round an upright or high-principled man. He had been an apothecary's apprentice, then, according to the commonly received story, a forger and coiner, who, in the barbarous fashion of the times, had been condemned to lose his ears and to stand in the pillory. For some time before his coming to Dee, he had led a wandering life, in the course of which his necromantic practices had included the digging up of a corpse in a Lancashire churchyard, and the summoning of the spirit of the dead man to reply to certain questions. Later, either in the wilds of Wales, or at Glastonbury in Somerset, the mystic Avalon, he was said to have found an alchemical manuscript of priceless value, as well as some of the famous powder of projection, which the adepts used in their attempted manufacture of gold. It would have been strange indeed if one in possession of such treasures, and with so glib a tongue in talking of them, and of his own psychic powers, had failed of a welcome in the house at Mortlake. Even if Dee guessed at the unedifying episodes in his new friend's past, the elder man's natural charity and kindliness led him to discount them, or even to regard them as an additional reason for showing benevolence to one who had already paid so dearly for his errors, and who was so young and gifted enough to amend his life. It was Mistress Dee who was troubled with premonitions of disaster. Until now, despite the slanders of the ignorant and the many annoyances from lack of money, the family life of the Dees had a certain tranquillity and decent order. In the course of it, an aged and honored mother had made a godly end. Children had been brought to the font of baptism, faithful servants had been duly and justly paid, and the master of the house, for all the shadow and black art that lay upon his studies, had been known as a pious and upright gentleman, whom Barnabas Saul had not, after all, been able to involve in his recent disgrace. Now the faithful wife dimly felt that this comparative peace and safety was about to be withdrawn, that her learned, unworldly husband was about to enter on a darker and more dangerous phase of study, under the leadership of this penniless but ingenuous stranger, with his strange air of authority and supernormal knowledge, and his violent, moody temper, which he took so little pains to conceal. She showed from the first a great dislike and distrust of Kelly, the name by which he soon came to be known in the household. But his wife's resentment, though there is evidence that Dee was much grieved and disturbed by it, was powerless against the growing influence of so wonderful and satisfactory a seer. Angelic visions in the show stone came thick and fast now. Angelic voices sounded often in the little inner room, once a bedchamber, where the philosopher, withdrawn from the household's comings and goings, and denied to even important guests, gave himself over more and more to the life of dreams. There were not wanting all the magical accessories of ceremonial scrying. By the end of the spring, Kelly had obtained, with Dee's aid and approval, the so-called table of practice, on which the stone was to be set with a red silk cloth of peculiar make spread under it, and an inscribed tablet of wax to serve as a pedestal. The legs of the table itself were also to be supported by similar but smaller tablets of wax. Then in late autumn came the acquisition of another crystal, called from the circumstances of its giving the angelical stone. Towards sunset, in the November of 1582, in the western window of the laboratory, there came to Dee's tranced eyes a vision of a child angel, bearing in his hands a bright object, clear and glorious, of the bigness of an egg. Later, Dee spoke to the Emperor Rudolph of this crystal as a gift of Uriel, the spirit of light, and said that it was of greater value than any earthly kingdom. It is almost certain that this show stone, however obtained, is the one still to be seen in the British Museum, together with 3 of the inscribed tablets of wax. Of these mystic seals it should here be mentioned that they bore, on their upper sides, the familiar Kabbalistic figure of interlaced triangles, the so-called pentangle or seal of Solomon, together with the 7 hidden names of God and the names of certain angels and spirits. The table of practice, which was made of sweet wood and was 2 cubits, or about 3 feet, in height, was also inscribed with sacred characters and with a mystic cruciform sign. In the accounts of the sittings we sometimes hear, moreover, of the curtain of the stone, but this was seen in the crystal and belonged not to the material but to the psychic accessories. The peculiar clouding of the stone which precedes the vision and follows after its departure is familiar to all crystal gazers. Stress has often been laid on the fact that Dee himself saw little or nothing. We have his own regretful statement, "You know, I cannot see or scry." But although both the character of his gift and the imperiousness of his temper made Kelly seem the leading spirit in this strange partnership, Dee, the careful recorder, eager questioner, and learned interpreter, was still in a sense the dominant force. The complaint of Kelly that the spirits address him in learned tongues which are incomprehensible to him is, to say the least of it, significant. And the angelic visitants were certainly more likely to have used Dee than Kelly for such a message addressed to the younger man as this, quote, "Thou, O youngling, but old sinner, why dost thou suffer thy blindness to increase? Why not yield thy limbs to the service and fulfilling of the eternal verity? Pluck up thy heart and follow the way that leadeth to the knowledge of the end." End quote. Again, on an occasion of Dee's absence, we hear of Kelly's unsuccessful attempt to summon a spirit known as Medicina, who had, in Dee's presence, previously appeared in the crystal. We have to bear in mind that the phenomenon of these seances cannot be explained as mere crystallomancy. The crystal purports to give no more than a fleeting vision of some future or far-off event. It utters no voice, and the figures that move in its dreamlike scenes are silent as puppets. Here the part played by the crystal irresistibly reminds us of the cabinet of modern spiritualistic seances. It is, generally speaking, a place from which materialized spirits emerge, and to which, having made themselves known and conversed for a while, they again return. The language in Dee's Liber Mysterium, or Book of Mysteries, otherwise known as the Spiritual Diary, in which the record of the transactions is set down, is often vague and ambiguous, but at least it leaves us in no doubt that the spiritual creatures were heard as well as seen, and that many of them manifested themselves outside the limits of the crystal. Dee, if he never actually saw them, was conscious of their presence, and, as we have already said, there were many occasions when he, not Kelly, seems to have been the mouthpiece of their messages. There is no doubt that he also had mediumistic gifts, though not of the showier order. Equally, there is no doubt that he did not knowingly employ those gifts in mere necromancy. The spirits he wished to converse with were not spirits of the dead, but the living angels of God, the higher ranks of creatures. But although the scrying now took up so much time and thought, and was rewarded by such frequent visions, it could not be said to be of much practical assistance in Dee's involved personal affairs. We know that he expected that it would be, and that he repeatedly put questions to the apparitions upon matters that troubled him. For instance, the refusal of the Queen's advisers to reform the calendar according to the calculations he, Dee, had made, and the baffling characters of some manuscripts of Kelly's, which were supposed to be related to hidden treasure or the means of manufacturing gold. Worldly anxieties were natural, since his debts at this time amounted to £300. But the spiritual voices answered him but vaguely. Even Michael, the spirit of wisdom, who frequently appeared in and sometimes outside the limits of the crystal, said little that could be used for practical guidance. He gave but mystic encouragements and counseled faith and patience. Nor did the scryer invariably have sight of such heavenly apparitions. Merry spirits of fantastic dress and foolish speech came and went, and vexed the grave scholar with occasional ribaldries. Yet withal Dee's confidence remained unbroken. His profound piety probably made him blame himself that knowledge was withheld. When the spirit known as Medicina finally said that there were no secrets save those that were buried in the shadow of men's souls, he voiced Dee's own belief that God desired to hide nothing from the faithful seeker. And to Kelly's frequent outbursts of angry impatience and threats to leave the unprofitable scrying and to follow some study whereby he may live, the scholar answered with firm serenity that he, for his part, was content to wait God's time. The seances, interrupted by occasional journeys of Kelly's, ostensibly with the object of seeking hidden treasure, had continued for about a year, when there came a new development. A distinguished foreign guest of the Queen, the Polish nobleman Aldebert Lasky, sent word to Mortlake that he desired to visit Dee, to see his books, and to talk with him of magic, a subject of which he, Lasky, professed to be a student. The Pole was by all accounts an intriguing and not particularly honest politician, who had taken French bribes in the matter of the election of Henry III of France to the crown of Poland, and who had aspired to that crown himself. His chief concern was to obtain money to further his ambitious schemes, and if money could be got by magical means, he was willing to patronize magicians. But he was a handsome and gracious-mannered man, and seems to have made a good impression at the house by the river, where, after having been introduced to Dee by Leicester, in the Earl's own apartments, he presented himself with only 2 attendants, and graciously tarried supper. Again, a month later, he came more ceremoniously by water, in a barge rowed by the Queen's men, and other visits followed. Dee had to apply to the Queen for funds to entertain this new patron, but the Polish prince professed to desire help from the spiritual creatures, and made flattering promises that he would reward their agents. A spirit known as Madimi, who appeared about this time in the shape of a pretty female child, and another feminine spirit called Galva, were questioned about the prince's political prospects. In Lasky's presence also, Kelly professed to summon Lasky's own guardian angel, and to learn of him concerning his charge. A good deal of practical information here mixes with the mystical. Lasky was told of Burleigh's dislike of him, and of possible danger if he remained in England. Dee also received mysterious warnings through Madimi of his own danger from spies, who suspected the Pole of treason, and hated Dee as well. Burleigh and Walsingham were said to be joined together against Dee. This house might be entered and searched. In addition to these causes for anxiety, Dee was getting seriously distressed by the behavior of Kelly, who was again threatening to depart, calling himself unfairly treated, and throwing himself into such mad fits of rage that Dee sincerely believed him possessed by evil spirits. To get rid of these, a form of exorcism was gone through by Madimi, an interesting spiritual creature who, in this and other matters, shows Dee's mental influence on the seances, and who on one occasion described Dee's faith and imagination as a kind of sight perfecter than Kelly's. Kelly professed himself much benefited by the exorcism, but his deliverance was short-lived, for a little later Dee's diary records another wild fit of rage. Dee's habitual gentleness doubtless emboldened the younger man to put no curb on his outbursts. Kelly had another easy victim, too, in the young wife whom he had married, shortly after his arrival at Mortlake, professedly at the command of the spirits, and without even the pretense of affection. Mistress Kelly also became an inmate of the philosopher's hospitable house, where Mistress D pitied and befriended her, but must have felt her presence an additional burden on D's already heavily taxed resources. Indeed, those resources were becoming more and more insufficient for what was required of them. In his devotion to the crystal, D seems to have largely neglected his astrological work, and did not, as in earlier years, add to his income by drawing the horoscopes of all and sundry. Kelly put him to continual expense. The queen was friendly, but the light of a royal countenance is not enough to live by. Altogether, the hour seemed ripe for some new venture, such as had been of late foreshadowed by the spirit voices. Lasky was returning to Poland, and was eager to take his new friends with him, to employ the supernatural wisdom to which they seemed to have access, in furtherance of his fortunes and the manufacture of the much-needed gold. It was a wild project, and there is some suggestion that Dee recognized its wildness, but Kelly urged him on, and after all, he was himself an incurable optimist and lover of noble patrons. In 1583, on the afternoon of September 21, which he does not forget to note was the calendar feast of St. Matthew, he left Mortlake, neglecting in characteristic fashion to arrange his financial affairs, and apparently believing that his absence would not extend over more than a few months. He was accompanied by his wife and 3 children, by the Kellys, and some servants. The party was joined by Lasky and his own attendants, and together they set out for Holland, en route for Poland. End of chapter 3.